There is, with a few points of disagreement, at least some consensus on which MCU installments have been the best, or the worst, or the just okay. But there is one less than beloved MCU movie that I absolutely adore, that I think is essential viewing for any MCU fan, and that I think best encapsulates the spirit and themes of the MCU more than any other installment. And that is Captain America, the First Avenger.
I guess I just don't know why you'd want to join the army if you were a beautiful dame. Or a woman. An agent, not a dame. You are beautiful, but...
Just in case you're under the illusion that everybody loves the First Avenger, let's disabuse you of that notion. Of the 37 feature films in the MCU, at least at the time of recording this video, Captain America the First Avenger is ranked number 20 out of 37 by Letterboxd users. Not terrible, but still bottom half. Number 22 out of 37 by Rotten Tomatoes critics. A little worse. We're approaching the bottom third now. Number 26 out of 37 by IMDb users. We're firmly in the bottom third now and just barely escaping the bottom 10. And number 33 out of 37 according to Rotten Tomatoes users. And that middling to bad reception doesn't stop with ratings and reviews. Of all 37 films in the MCU, Captain America the First Avenger had the 4th worst domestic box office performance. So even though there's some variation in reception between platforms and metrics, Captain America the First Avenger is universally recognized as being at least in the bottom half of the MCU. The only disagreement is just how close to the bottom it is. So I'd like to state my case as to why this movie deserves so much better. This video contains full spoilers for Captain America the First Avenger, but I will do my best to avoid spoiling other MCU installments just to be safe. The First Avenger was only the 5th film in the MCU, and in my opinion, it was their biggest gamble prior to the Avengers. It's one of only 2 MCU films to have the majority of its events set in the past, the other being Captain Marvel, which was set in the 1990s. It also works perfectly as an introduction to many pillars of the MCU. Stark Industries and Howard Stark, the Tesseract, first of the Infinity Stones and central MacGuffin of the Avengers, and the Strategic Scientific Reserve, a precursor to S.H.I.E.L.D. But the single most important factor behind why I think The First Avenger is the most underrated movie in the MCU, besides my own personal enjoyment of the film, is that I think it essentially acts as the thesis film for what a Marvel superhero is. In more ways than one, Captain America really is the First Avenger, embodying a courage, empathy, selflessness, and sense of duty that sets the bar for all other heroes in the MCU. The internet is full of people like me trying to make objective arguments to justify their subjective likes and dislikes, so in an attempt to be a little more methodical and honest, I'm going to break down everything I think works and doesn't work about the First Avenger, in the hopes that you ultimately come to see the movie as I do. The movie opens with a mysterious prologue. S.H.I.E.L.D. agents arrive at a dig site in the Arctic. There's a strange ship, man-made, not alien, but no design they recognize. Inside it, frozen within the ice, is a shield. It bears a symbol they do recognize. Then, not Phil Coulson tells someone to call maybe Nick Fury, and we jump right into the past. I have a mixed relationship with this prologue. It's structurally fine, and it's better than some others in the MCU, but on repeat viewings, I tend to skip it. I think if it weren't there, it would make the epilogue hit a little bit harder, but it is there, and really attentive viewers who can remember what the ship looked like nearly 2 hours later may even find that it helps increase the stakes going into the climax. The real opening of the film is Red Skull's discovery of the Tesseract, the result of a presumably long off-screen search. Red Skull's car is ridiculous in a way that harkens back to 1940s serials. He honestly feels like a Dick Tracy villain here, and I'm not complaining. This is the exact vibe a Captain America adaptation set in the 40s should be going for. It's a strong introduction for a villain who, in no small part thanks to Hugo Weaving, carries way more screen presence than many other MCU villains. The First Avenger is also early enough in the MCU that they were still casting recognizable actors in microscopically tiny roles. They didn't yet know they'd eventually need every last member of the Screen Actors Guild. David Bradley, who you may recognize as Filch in the Harry Potter films, is perfect in his little unnamed role as the keeper of the Tesseract. This opening scene takes place in Tonsberg, Norway, which is also featured in the prologue of the first Thor movie. This location becomes an important recurring setting much later in the MCU, but right now it's just a great example of those early connections between MCU movies that made this world feel so fleshed out right from the beginning. The First Avenger and the first Thor movie can really be watched in any order, with each film's references to the other only enhancing the experience and never spoiling anything. After Red Skull leaves with the Tesseract and kills all the witnesses, we jump to Brooklyn, New York, and meet Steve Rogers, who's in the middle of his 4th attempt to enlist in the US Army. The animation of Skinny Steve is something you either buy or you don't. The Uncanny Valley is different for everyone, and this is one that doesn't bother me, but I won't argue if it bothers you. After being denied enlistment yet again, Steve goes to the theater to catch up on the news. But when he stands up to a jerk who's upsetting other theater patrons, he gets his face punched in.
You just don't know when to give up, do you?
I can do this all day.
The "I can do this all day" line is one of 2 catchphrases given to the MCU's Captain America, the other being "on your left" from the Winter Soldier. But "I can do this all day" only carries meaning because of this scene. Here, weak and outmanned, Steve doesn't care if he's going to lose. If the fight is noble, it's worth losing. Steve is saved by his best friend, Bucky Barnes. The presentation of Bucky and Steve's friendship in this movie is critical, and if you don't invest in it here, then the Winter Soldier and Civil War do not work nearly as effectively. And spoilers, but the filmmakers only have the first half of this movie to sell you on this relationship.
Remember when I made you ride the Cyclone at Coney Island?
Yeah, and I threw up.
This isn't payback, is it?
Also, Steve picking up the trash can lid is a campy, fun allusion to his future shield, but it's not the only one. Why Marvel felt that they had to build up to the idea of Captain America wielding a shield? I'm not sure, but they definitely did. We progress from the trash can lid, to the cab door with a star on it, to the decorative flag shield, to the unpainted vibranium shield, before finally settling on the iconic shield. Then Bucky drags Steve on a double date to the World of Tomorrow fair, which is absolutely wonderful. Again, I'm here for the camp, including the floating car presented by none other than Howard Stark. I've always had a soft spot for the Dominic Cooper version of Howard. Nothing against the Roger Sterling version, but I like the idea of Tony as a chip off the old block, and I think that's better exemplified in Dominic Cooper's performance. This is a tangent, but I've always thought that the scene with the showgirls perfectly complements Tony's arrival at the Stark Expo in Iron Man 2. This is a tangent within a tangent, but I've always thought that watching the First Avenger between Iron Man 1 and Iron Man 2 gives Howard Stark a great and conclusive arc. His legacy hangs over Tony and Stark Industries in Iron Man. Then we get to know the young him in the First Avenger, who's very different from the specter of the tycoon we saw in Iron Man. And then in Iron Man 2, Tony discovers who his father really was, and we get to see who he grew up to be. It's clean and narratively succinct. And all other future appearances of Howard do nothing to alter that arc. They only support it. One other note about the fair, I enjoy the totally benign Easter egg of the original Human Torch, one of the first Marvel Comics characters. It was a simpler time when the fan community didn't expect every reference or Easter egg to get its own Disney Plus series, so the MCU was free to drop a fun, casual reference without it being considered a promise. I'll acknowledge that it's a plot contrivance to have Dr. Erskine discover Steve just by walking through a recruiting station at the fair, but the conversation Erskine overhears really does reveal enough about Steve's character to justifiably pique his curiosity. When Bucky catches Steve trying to enlist yet again, he accuses Steve of just being eager to fight, and suggests that there are other important jobs Steve could do to help with the war effort. Steve says,
Bucky, come on, there are men laying down their lives. I got no right to do any less than them.
The film goes on to prove this is not just talk from Steve. He's not only willing to lay down his life for others, he believes it's his duty.
This isn't about me.
Right. Because you got nothing to prove.
I'm not so naive that I can't recognize the pride in Steve Rogers. He absolutely has a chip on his shoulder, and that character trait could justify a villain's arc. But the distinction with Steve is that he's not out to change how others see him. His inner need is about proving to himself that he's the man he wants to be. We actually see throughout the First Avenger and Steve's future appearances in the MCU how uncomfortable he is with the spotlight. He's a natural leader, but not a natural celebrity. He doesn't want the fame and fortune, he only wants to do what he genuinely believes is right. This accusation for Bucky could absolutely be taken as an insult, and Erskine, having spent time around young cadets, is surely used to insult escalating to physical conflict. But Steve does the opposite. He doesn't argue, he accepts the criticism without conceding his ultimate point. Then the girls Bucky invited to the fair call for him, and Erskine gets to see Steve choose to leave behind a double date and dancing for another attempt to enlist, further suggesting Steve's desire to enlist isn't about impressing anybody.
Don't do anything stupid until I get back.
How can I? Taking all the stupid with you.
Then we get this playful barb between Steve and Bucky, two men who could have been fighting, but instead are loving to each other, ending their disagreement with a hug of all things. This is one of the healthiest male friendships in the MCU, and by 1940 standards, it certainly would have stood out to Erskine. So in a single overheard conversation, Erskine learns that Steve has a strong sense of obligation to do what's right, that he's not unreasonable nor quick to anger, that he's emotionally honest and capable of deep relationships, and that he's self-sacrificing. That's enough for Erskine to take an interest, but it isn't everything. He tests him further, asking him questions and playing mind games with him. Right away, Erskine's accent is a test. If Steve's desire to join the war was built on any sort of nationalist prejudice or xenophobia, it would be apparent in the way he responds to this German man's interrogation.
So, you want to go overseas? Kill some Nazis.
Excuse me?
Steve correctly identifies that he's being tested, but instead of trying to guess at the answer he thinks Erskine might want to hear, he takes a deep breath and answers honestly, putting yet another attempted enlistment on the line in favor of being genuine.
I don't want to kill anyone. I don't like bullies. I don't care where they're from.
This line is quite possibly the most succinct way you could summarize Steve Rogers' beliefs. It stays true throughout the MCU, with him always punching upwards and never punching downwards. Steve passes Erskine's test, and his fifth attempt to enlist is the one that sticks. Steve is a great protagonist, but the MCU recognized from the very beginning that he works best as one part of a dynamic, like the straight man in a comedic duo. Joss Whedon plays him off of Iron Man and the Avengers, Marcus and McFeely play him off of Black Widow and the Winter Soldier. I'd argue Steve gets a little lost in the mix in Age of Ultron and Infinity War because he doesn't get a consistent dynamic scene partner to play off of. All that's to say that from the moment Peggy Carter enters this film, everything clicks. It doesn't hurt that Hayley Atwell has an incredible screen presence and is perfectly cast. There's a reason the MCU has never wanted to let her go, giving her her own live-action show for 2 seasons and making her the de facto lead of 3 seasons of the animated show What If. Tommy Lee Jones as Colonel Phillips is another example of the swing-for-the-fences casting of the early MCU, when they were unafraid to use a famous veteran actor in a single one-off appearance. The fact that neither Jones nor his character have ever reappeared in the MCU is just another reason to revisit this movie. We also meet Gilmore Hodge, who serves as the perfect example of everything Steve isn't. Steve is what Erskine has been looking for, and Hodge is what he's kept finding. Hodge's presence highlights Steve's virtues. It should be noted that Phillips likes Hodge because he's exactly what he's used to out of a good soldier. The grenade scene settles the argument between Phillips and Erskine and proves that Steve is the obvious choice for the serum.
Grenade!
But there's a detail you might not notice on your first watch. Of the people present who didn't know the grenade was fake, Peggy is the only other one who moves toward it. Steve beats her there because he was closer, but it does beg the question whether Peggy was ever considered for the serum, even for a moment. Erskine and Phillips are portrayed positively in The First Avenger as very forward-thinking for their time, but this was still the 1940s, and I don't know if you've noticed, but Peggy is a woman. But I'm grateful that the What If series eventually explored the possibility of Peggy receiving the serum, and I don't think it's as far-fetched of a premise as it may initially seem. Now this scene, this is the scene. It's also an exposition dump about Red Skull and his relationship to Erskine, but that stuff is inserted, if somewhat awkwardly, into a real moment between Steve and Erskine. It's the night before the procedure, and they're both nervous. Erskine because he's seen it go wrong before, and Steve because he's not sure if he's really cut out for it.
Whatever happens tomorrow, you must promise me one thing. It's that you will stay who you are. Not a perfect soldier, but a good man.
This is it. This promise is the root of all of Steve's future conflicts. Throughout the MCU, at every turn, he has to make the decision whether to be the perfect soldier or a good man. Erskine also casually drops this bit of lore.
The serum amplifies everything that is inside, so good becomes great. Bad becomes worse.
It's a little woo-woo, and I'm not sure that Erskine means it literally, but it is something I think about in Steve's future appearances in the MCU. Maybe the serum really did amplify who he was, make a good man a great one. Peggy accompanies Steve to the secret SSR bunker where the procedure is set to take place. This is the closest thing they've had to a moment alone, and it allows them to get to know each other a little better.
You must have danced.
Well, the past few years just didn't seem to matter that much. Figured I'd wait.
For what?
Right partner.
This whole waiting for the right partner line is just so wholesome and adorable. And if I could geek out for a moment, it's so nice to see the MCU using real in-camera techniques to make skinny Steve look smaller. He's not all practical. It's actually a weird mix of effects. If you watch the behind-the-scenes stuff, you'll see what I mean. But I'll take any amount of practical effects I can get because they are absent in future MCU installments. Later in the film, we get a fun little cameo by the body double for Skinny Steve. So you don't have to feel bad for this actor. He's still got a speaking line and his real face on camera. I'd also like to shout out the oldest spy in the MCU, played by Amanda Walker, who isn't quite of the Tommy Lee Jones or even David Bradley level of recognizability, but she is a storied British actress with over 7 decades of credits, and her character is the perfect example of how tight the writing is in this movie. Steve and Peggy walk into an antique shop. An old woman emerges looking exactly like an antique shop owner. Peggy meets her innocuous greeting with an oddly out-of-character reply, which lets us know that they're speaking in code. The old woman hits a secret button, revealing a hidden gun in the process, and Steve and Peggy enter the back room of the shop to access the SSR's hidden bunker beneath Brooklyn. Sometime later, when, spoilers, a Hydra agent escapes from the bunker with the super soldier serum, this old woman emerges with the gun we already established and fires at the Hydra agent, but she is shot and killed in the process. She's on screen for 14 seconds, says 6 words, and gets an entire character arc. An entire character arc, from introduction to subversion of expectations to death. It's just great writing. We also get the secret entrance to an SSR base being hidden behind a bookshelf, which is an idea that the Winter Soldier repeats to a T. Then Steve and Peggy are in the base. We all know Steve Rogers isn't going to die 30 minutes into this movie, but the filmmakers don't hand-wave the stakes of the procedure. The movie plays along, amping up the nervous tension from the moment Steve walks into the lab. All eyes are on him, and we even see that Peggy is nervous for him. But because these films are meant for all ages, they also undercut the tension with little gags here and there.
You hear me? Is this on?
This Marvel tendency to undercut tension with humor has been the subject of increasing criticism over the years. But I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with it, as long as it's justified within the narrative and makes sense for the characters, as it does here. The reveal that Howard Stark is involved with the Super Soldier program is a little clunky. It makes sense, given his reputation as a boy genius. I just wish they had seeded his collaboration with Erskine in the Super Soldier program a little earlier, even if it was just a quick one-off line. But he's here now, so I'm dealing with it. Erskine provides an exposition dump that explains how his serum works, in a pseudoscience sort of way, just in case any viewers need a little coaxing to suspend their disbelief. The most important note for the rest of the MCU is that it isn't just the serum that turns Steve into Captain America, it's the Vita rays, and the quantity and rate at which both are applied. This is why simply stealing or recreating the serum hasn't led to an army of Captain Americas running around the MCU. The exact knowledge to recreate this exact process died with Erskine. Spoilers, about 3 minutes from now. I appreciate that the movie takes its time with Steve's transformation, again, all to help with believability. They don't just flip a switch. It's painful for Steve. I also love that Peggy leaps into action when Steve starts screaming from inside the chamber. I don't think Peggy's feelings here are romantic quite yet, but she has started to care for Steve enough that she doesn't want to see him die for the cause. But Steve pushes through the pain and emerges an absolute beefcake. I may have just said that Peggy's feelings for Steve aren't romantic, but I think this is the moment where they start to become physical. The guy who she liked and respected but maybe pitied a little bit is suddenly transformed into a heartthrob. And even as professional as Peggy is, she literally can't contain herself. This little bit of physical acting is just oozing with sexual chemistry. Like, wow. But the love fest doesn't last long. The party is interrupted when a Hydra spy sets off an explosive, steals the last vial of serum, and shoots and kills Dr. Erskine. And then we get one of the best and most understated death scenes in the MCU. Erskine doesn't get any last words, just an action, and one that carries meaning only for Steve. Erskine points to Steve's heart, and with the smallest gesture, reminds him of his promise.
That you will stay who you are. Not a perfect soldier, but a good man.
A Hydra spy has just killed the first person to ever truly recognize Steve Rogers' potential. And for the first time in his life, Steve is the most qualified person to do something about it. It's worth pointing out that we're nearly 40 minutes into this movie before we get our first action scene. And I can't tell you how much I love this restraint. The MCU seems to be afraid to recreate this. Taking scripts like the first Doctor Strange, where the action doesn't organically begin for quite some time, and stapling an action scene onto the front of the movie as a prologue, so audiences don't get bored. I understand that we live in a world of short attention spans, but building up to an action scene only makes it more effective. I also have to acknowledge my own personal sensibilities here. Many of my favorite MCU installments are the least action heavy. Shows like WandaVision, Agatha All Along, and Loki are highlights of the entire MCU for me, and they also happen to have the least amount of punching. I'm here for character and drama, so my enjoyment of an action scene really only goes as far as it serves those two masters. The first proper action scene of the First Avenger does serve multiple narrative and character functions. It catapults Steve into the conflict with Hydra, and it gives him a chance to learn his new body and abilities. It's like the sequence from Sam Raimi's first Spider-Man film, where Peter is progressively testing out each of his abilities, but subtly layered into a single action scene. It's like a highly effective tutorial level of a video game. I also love that Peggy is competent in this movie. She's never a damsel in distress. She was the only one in the room to spring into action when the Hydra spy revealed himself. She immediately shot him, then set off chasing him. Even here. We don't know that she didn't have him. We also learn along with Steve that his new powers won't solve every situation. He can't brute force a win when his opponent has a child held hostage at gunpoint. Steve doesn't know whether bullets can hurt him or kill him, but he still steps into the line of fire to try to barter for the child's life. The gun turns out to be empty, but that's besides the point. Steve was prepared to be shot point blank. Then when the spy throws the child into the water, we're given another chance to define Steve's ethics.
No, don't!
He chooses saving lives over stopping bad guys.
Go get him! I can swim!
This movie is constantly reminding us of Steve's values and where he falls on the spectrum of heroes. I think it's something you could easily take for granted, but it's noticeable when it's absent. Think about the near constant issues with Zack Snyder's Superman, whose morals and ethics were near impossible to pin down at any point over 3 full-length films. Right from the beginning of the First Avenger, you know what Steve stands for, and the rest of the movie just reinforces his values and beliefs. The sequence ends with Steve successfully apprehending his first villain and winning his first conflict, but the victory is short-lived. We get the iconic line,
Hail Hydra!
as the spy chooses suicide over capture. It's a great moment. But it also puts off the problem of whether or not Steve Rogers is a killer. One thing the MCU never really figured out is how to tackle Steve's relationship to killing. The burden of this problem can't be entirely put on the First Avenger, as it's an issue throughout the MCU, but it is still a failure of this movie. It's always a little bit jarring when you see Captain America straight up murder someone, because it feels counter to who Steve is as a person. The MCU eventually learns to avoid this problem by pitting Steve against creatures we can just hope aren't sentient, and villains who are such a threat that mercy is not an option. The way the First Avenger works around this problem is by making his enemies literal faceless goons. You could get into a debate about the nature of wartime and the unique ethics of such a conflict. I'm no historian, but World War II is kind of popularly considered to be the last US military conflict that most of us can agree we were on the right side of. So the First Avenger has that protective blanket to somewhat shield Captain America's actions from viewer scrutiny. But Steve does unfortunately continue to kill long after the war is won. So I'll just say that for me, Steve makes the most sense when he is apprehending villains and the least when he is punting goons into the ocean. Throughout the first act of the First Avenger, we've been intercutting between our protagonist and our antagonist, who are separated by a continent and won't even meet until halfway into the movie. It's not a structural device I love in screenplays, but it is a very common one. The point is just to keep you invested in the antagonist until they become more directly relevant to the protagonist's story. I think the First Avenger uses this structure well enough because Red Skull and Arnim Zola's work is bizarre and intriguing, and these scenes occur in such small snippets that they don't detract from the momentum of Steve's story. These scenes also have a clear progression to them, escalating from Red Skull's discovery of the Tesseract to Zola's harnessing of it as a weapon, which then allows Red Skull's Hydra to formally break up with the German government. Overall, these scenes are effective enough and don't feel like wasted time. An example of this intercutting structure done poorly would be Iron Man 2, with every scene of Ivan Vanko prior to meeting Tony on the racetrack being completely disposable. Don't believe me? Watch the film again and skip every Ivan scene until the racetrack and tell me the movie isn't better for it. The First Avenger's second act sends Steve in a totally new direction. With Erskine dead and the secret recipe lost, the super soldier program is considered a failure, despite Steve's successful results. The US military, a la Colonel Phillips, doesn't see the value in a single super soldier.
I asked for an army and all I got was you. You were not enough.
We as viewers are so used to the superhero archetype by this point, it's interesting that the First Avenger takes its time to establish the difference one person can make and the skepticism others may have to that idea. This is Torch. She keeps interrupting my recording. I need you all to tell her that she's very bad. She's a very bad girl. Even though the military doesn't recognize Steve's value yet, a US senator sees potential in him as a propagandic mascot for selling war bonds. So Steve becomes his dancing monkey. This sequence is corny as hell, and I absolutely love it. If you prefer your superheroes self-serious and only unintentionally corny, this is where the tone of the First Avenger might lose you. But boy does it work for me. To this day, I'll be walking around the house and just randomly belt out, Hoboken to Spokane! And yes, I know every word to this song. And I consider this musical montage to be one of the most effective montages I've ever seen, advancing the plot and developing Steve's character both at lightning speed in a way that's hilarious and entertaining and feels totally organic to the world of the story. As we've previously seen Steve learn the ins and outs of his new body during the chase scene with the Hydra spy, we're now watching Steve exercise a very different muscle. Throughout the montage, he becomes progressively more confident and charismatic, an underrated but necessary aspect of Captain America's future role as the de facto leader of the Avengers. This montage also manages to birth one of my absolute favorite MCU conspiracy theories that is 100% part of my personal headcanon in just a few seconds of screen time. Steve even gets a little bit caught up in the hype of the Captain America persona before he's brought right back down to Earth by a visit to the battlefront. When he sees the state of what's left of the 107th, the unit he wanted to join and the unit Bucky did join, Steve is reminded that his calling was never to be a mascot. When Steve learns that Bucky is missing behind enemy lines and Colonel Phillips has no plans to risk more men trying to rescue him, Steve takes matters into his own hands. Peggy has believed in Steve from the beginning, but to his and our surprise, Howard Stark is ready to jump in and help as well. We get a little bit of romantic tension as Steve tries to feel out whether Stark is a rival for Peggy's affection, but they don't have time. When they drop him behind enemy lines, the tables have turned, and now Steve is the spy infiltrating a Hydra base. This is the last time I'll mention it, but it's never not weird seeing Captain America carry a gun. I mean, it's not as jarring as Batman with a gun, but it's close. As far as I can recall, the last time we see Steve use a gun is briefly in the Avengers, then he never picks one up again. So I can't be the only one who found it unnatural. This infiltration sequence is where we meet the Howling Commandos. This makeshift team is admittedly hokey, but they serve two narrative points. the most important of which is reiterating Captain America's values. He's not fighting for any one race, nationality, or creed. He is a hero for all, whose only enemy is those who seek to use their power to oppress others. The second and less essential point has to do with showing Steve as a team leader. Marvel already knew that the next appearances of Captain America and Thor would be as members of the Avengers, so they felt the need to establish in their solo movies how their titular heroes would work within team dynamics. I expect this was a concern based around taking 4 different lead characters from different movies and recontextualizing them as co-leads or supporting characters. You have to remember that there was no precedent for this. The Hulk is an infamous loner, and it took 2 films to get Iron Man to play nice with even his best friend. So Feige, or whomever in the Marvel Studios think tank at the time, felt that we at least needed to be familiar with Thor and Steve working with a team. It honestly works a bit better in Thor, as the team is smaller and more organically comprised of friends and compatriots he's accumulated over the years, while Steve's team comes prepackaged in a single jail cell. Regardless, the Howling Commandos aren't really a significant part of the movie, and their reappearances in the MCU have been few and far between. There are some subtle color motifs throughout the First Avenger, with some obvious examples being Steve in blue, Peggy in brown, and Red Skull in, well, red, but a lesser one is the association between Zola and green. He's introduced behind a green lens, and when Steve discovers Bucky, it's never explicitly stated that he was experimented on, but he is strapped to a table in Zola's office. This is a room we've never seen before, so how do we know it's Zola's office? Well, we see him fleeing with some of his documents, but more importantly, we feel it, because everything is awash in green lighting. It's a purely thematic choice that lets us know something strange happened to Bucky in there without telling us exactly what. As Steve and Bucky make their escape, they come face to face with a fleeing Zola and Red Skull, who reveals his true form for the first time. He may have lost the battle, but he is still at the height of his power. He has killed Erskine, harnessed the Tesseract, and established full control of Hydra as an independent army. He has nothing to hide anymore. But Steve has also leveled up. As he returns to camp with not only Bucky, but dozens of other POWs, he is celebrated as a hero, not a mascot, for the first time in his life.
Let's hear it for Captain America!
We're halfway through the movie, and we now have a fully realized Captain America and a fully realized Red Skull, finally positioned against each other as 1v1 adversaries. But Red Skull has a totalitarian stranglehold on his Hydra soldiers, while Captain America has the earned loyalty and respect of the US military. This may be a good time to acknowledge that Chris Evans genuinely disappears into this role for me. I was very familiar with Evans before the First Avenger came out, from movies like Scott Pilgrim vs. the World, Not Another Teen Movie, Fantastic Four, but this time the Silver Surfer. But when I see Chris Evans in the MCU, I don't see Chris Evans. I see Steve Rogers. Steve is often quiet, stoic, and still, moving only when he must, speaking only when he has something to say, which is totally counter to Chris Evans' type prior to the First Avenger. It was a highly contested quote when Quentin Tarantino said that actors in the MCU aren't movie stars, but he is totally right. In his exact words, Captain America is the star, not Chris Evans. He disappears into the role completely, with subtlety and confidence, inhabiting Steve in a way that doesn't feel like a performance.
Who are you supposed to be?
Captain America.
Beg your pardon?
We see Steve and his merry band chipping away at Hydra in montage, and frankly, it could be more exciting. It just feels a little expositional. The interesting bit is the new dynamic between Steve and Bucky, who feels a bit like the older brother whose little brother has suddenly outpaced him in height. There's still love between them, but the balance of power in the relationship has forever shifted. Ever since their reunion, the film has also made efforts to differentiate them in combat style. Bucky is portrayed in a darker light, more likely to snipe a target from a distance than engage them in hand-to-hand combat. It's apparent that there were already at least some inklings about doing a Winter Soldier plotline. They originally signed Sebastian Stan to a 9-picture deal. So the First Avenger starts that progression early, planting valuable seeds for the Russos to pick up later. But the real narrative thrust during this section of the film is the budding romance between Steve and Peggy. The tension between them has absolutely ratcheted up. Neither of them are the type for a fling, so this little dance is them testing the waters one step at a time to determine if the other really is
The right partner.
But Steve and Peggy's flirtation is thrown a curveball when Natalie Dormer, yet another example of the early MCU's burn through IMDb casting strategy, comes on to Steve, and he fails to deflect it. This is very soap opera, which in turn is very Shakespearean. It's a classic staple of romance and rom-coms, the "wait, I can explain" moment. But I do think it makes sense for the characters here. Steve went from getting zero attention from the opposite sex to being a famous hunk and a war hero nearly overnight. It's perfectly plausible for beautiful women to be coming on to him, and it's even more plausible for him to have no idea what to do with that. And unlike a rom-com, the First Avenger doesn't drag this conflict out. Peggy learns almost immediately that Steve is very much still holding on to feelings for her, and the kiss is never brought up again. But it does slow down their slow burn romance in a way that, if you know how the film ends, makes it all the more tragic. They just didn't have the time. When Steve finally gets his iconic shield, it looks great. But the impossible physics do require a suspension of disbelief. And I think it helps if you've already seen Thor's magic hammer flying around. But within the context of this movie, you may just have to give it to them that this strange and impossible rare metal behaves in ways that don't make apparent sense. Then we come to the train sequence, which is probably the best action sequence in the film, and the only one since Steve chased down the Hydra spy that feels like a real set piece. It takes its time, building real suspense, and its stakes turn out to be real as well, as Steve faces his first loss in his war against Hydra, his best friend. Steve blames himself, and his attempt to bury that feeling with alcohol fails when he learns his new body comes with a metabolism that prevents him from getting drunk. It's Peggy that pulls him out, not as a romantic partner, but as what he needs even more right now, a friend. Bucky's death, though a terrible cost, was the price paid to capture Red Skull's number 2. And Arnim Zola's interrogation by Colonel Phillips is unnecessarily compelling for a conversation between two supporting characters across a table. It's exposition, yes, but they give Tommy Lee Jones and Toby Jones, no relation, something to chew on. I've always loved this exchange.
You do realize that's nuts, don't you?
The sanity of the plan is of no consequence.
And why is that?
Because he can do it.
The First Avenger is not a grounded World War II period piece, if you hadn't noticed. It takes that framework, but it layers it with heightened fantastical elements. So it's refreshing to see two characters acknowledge that it doesn't matter if it's fantasy, if the stakes are real to the characters. We're also reminded of Red Skull's true plan that was hinted at by the maps in his office earlier in the movie, and the reason he's opted not to engage himself in this conflict with Captain America, but rather to ignore him and go about his work.
What's his target?
Target is everywhere.
Red Skull tends to disfigure the world with Tesseract-powered bombs that, if successful, will leave both sides of the war defeated and only Hydra left to rule. Faced with a ticking clock, the team looks to Steve, who suggests a direct approach. Steve's assault results in a good bit of damage to the last remaining Hydra base before he is captured. Red Skull assumes Steve must have a similarly sized ego to his own if he was trying to take down their stronghold by himself, which blinds him to the truth, that Steve wanted to be caught. When reinforcements arrive, Red Skull again chooses flight over fight. All that matters is his plan, and if he succeeds, all conflicts are settled. Steve goes after him, but can't catch up without a little help from his friends. There's an ongoing lesson here about allies being Steve's strength and a lack of allies being Red Skull's weakness. It's on the nose, but I thought I at least needed to mention it once in this video. Before Steve boards the plane, Peggy tells him to wait, and they kiss for the first time. Is it terrible timing? Yes. But in their war with Hydra, there has never been a good time. If they don't steal a moment, they'll never get one. So that's what Peggy does. Steve boards the plane via the landing gear, discovers the very neatly labeled bombs, and dispatches all but one, which, through a series of action hijinks, becomes lodged in the plane. Then we get our final confrontation, Captain America versus the Red Skull. In terms of powers, they are equally matched, and perhaps matched in their will as well. But when the Tesseract powering the plane becomes dislodged, it's ultimately Red Skull's ego that defeats him. By attempting to hold the power of the gods in the palm of his hand, he unleashes its true power, which was only hinted at by the vaporizing weapons. The Tesseract opens up a window to space, and the Red Skull is teleported or vaporized, depending on what knowledge you bring into this scene. and the Tesseract is lost. Steve takes control of the ship, but he can't stop it. It's on autopilot, heading straight to New York City, armed with a bomb Steve can't remove, and attempting to land could trigger the bomb and result in untold casualties. Steve only has one choice. Peggy barters for a moment, but she realizes Steve can't be talked out of it. If he could, he wouldn't be Steve Rogers. So Steve and Peggy engage in a fantasy, pretending if only for a moment that the life they could have had can still be theirs.
You're gonna need a rain check on that dance.
All right. A week next Saturday at the Stork Club.
You got it.
8 o'clock on the dot. Don't you dare be late.
We'll have the band play something slow.
I hate to step on your...
Steve?
It's one of the most hauntingly tragic moments of the entire MCU. The film resolves extremely quickly after that, refusing to give you time for its emotional climax to become any less painful. We get a melancholy montage of the post-war celebrations and all the people whose lives were saved by Captain America. I love that Peggy's last moment is looking at Steve's file with a photo of Skinny Steve. That's the real Steve, the man inside the hero, and the man whose heart she fell in love with. Then we get what would have been the single best post-credit scene in the MCU, if they hadn't been cowards and put it before the credits. But seriously, I'm convinced that this was written as a post-credit scene because The First Avenger is the first MCU movie that doesn't have one. It does that dumb thing that only a few others have since and shows a teaser for the next movie instead of a proper post-credit scene. Not to make excuses for Marvel, but this scene of Steve waking up in the present is critical to your understanding of the film. And as this was only the 5th MCU movie, audiences weren't quite as well trained as they are now to stay through the credits. I imagine it would have been a bit jarring for audience members who watched Steve die and then left the theater to then see him in trailers for the Avengers just a few months later. So I get it, but damn is it a missed opportunity. It's just such a gut punch to end the movie on.
I had a date.
I love everything about this scene, except the fact that this isn't Natasha Romanoff. The First Avenger was directed by Joe Johnston, the filmmaker behind one of my childhood favorites, Jumanji, and another film called The Rocketeer. In many ways, The Rocketeer was a prototypical superhero film that has a lot of unusual similarities to The First Avenger. Tell me if any of this sounds familiar. The Rocketeer was produced by Disney, was a period piece about a man becoming a superhero. It featured Nazis and an eccentric rich man named Howard. Honestly, there are so many similarities between The Rocketeer and The First Avenger that topic warrants its own video. Joe Johnston turned out to be a one-hit wonder for the MCU, but screenwriters Marcus and McFeely stayed on to write The Winter Soldier, Civil War, Avengers Infinity War, Avengers Endgame, and Thor the Dark World. One thing I can't really get across in this video because of YouTube's policies on music copyright is how incredible Alan Silvestri's score is. Silvestri originated the iconic Avengers theme and went on to score Infinity War, Endgame, Doomsday, Secret Wars, but The First Avenger is the only non-Avengers movie he has scored for the MCU. And again, I can't really show this, but The First Avenger is a score-heavy movie. His score is keeping us in period while emphasizing emotional beats and honestly doing a lot of the heavy lifting. It may be the most underrated aspect of this already underrated movie. Whenever people talk about the best or worst films in a series, it's remarkably common for their favorite to be the second film. Think about The Godfather Part 2, or The Empire Strikes Back, or The Dark Knight, or The Winter Soldier. So is The Winter Soldier a better movie than The First Avenger? Sure. But that's at least partly because it and the rest of the MCU build upon what worked about The First Avenger. Steve Rogers' relentless values, the tragedy of Steve and Peggy's separation, Steve's friendship with Bucky, Hydra, S.H.I.E.L.D., Howard Stark, Arnim Zola, Super Soldiers, Vibranium, Infinity Stones. To The Winter Soldier's credit, it's partly a great sequel because it doesn't attempt to rehash or recapture the specific magic of The First Avenger. Marcus and McFeely move confidently in a new direction, something they couldn't do if The First Avenger hadn't worked as well as it does. When The First Avenger was released, it was actually a little bit better received both critically and commercially than the 3 films that preceded it, The Incredible Hulk, Iron Man 2, and Thor. It didn't come anywhere close to the heights of Iron Man, the goodwill from which carried fans all the way through to the Avengers, and it certainly didn't reach the heights of the Avengers, which realized the promise of Iron Man's post-credit scene and really sold people on the vision of the MCU. But as the last baton holder in the race to the Avengers, the First Avenger did more than the 3 films that came before it. And who knows, if it wasn't as good as it is, there might have been far less momentum and goodwill coming into the Avengers. With the exception of Iron Man and the Avengers, Captain America the First Avenger and the rest of the Phase 1 films have essentially been left behind critically and commercially, including by its own direct sequels, The Winter Soldier and Civil War. But the First Avenger's DNA is everywhere. While it's an important contributor to Phase 1, I think its legacy throughout the rest of the MCU is even more apparent. It's hard for me to get too specific without spoilers, but I will say that the narrative threads established in the First Avenger carry over directly and prominently into The Winter Soldier, Civil War, Agent Carter, and the entire Avengers franchise. The final moment of the entire Infinity Saga, the culminating shot, is the resolution of a narrative thread that began in the First Avenger. And you can feel the fingerprints of the First Avenger to a lesser extent in films like Ant-Man, Black Panther, Spider-Man Homecoming, and well into the Multiverse Saga, and potentially beyond. To this day, the First Avenger is a unique movie within the MCU, offering its own flavor that isn't just a repackaging of the house style. If it's been a while since you've seen it, I'd recommend you give it another look. And if you've never seen it, I'm sorry I just spoiled everything for you, but I do think the movie has a lot of rewatch value, so I'd still recommend it. Thanks so much for watching. This is actually my first video on this channel in several years, and I wasn't even frozen in ice. But I do plan on posting a lot more and a lot more frequently, so if you don't want to miss the next one, please subscribe. Thanks so much, and I sincerely appreciate it.